A blistering blizzard, a shivering teenage girl stranded in the dead of night, and a worn, heavy coat offered by a passing stranger. It was a simple act of human decency, but when the terrifying roar of a Hells Angels motorcycle club surrounded his workplace, days later, he realized that coat belonged to the daughter of the club's most ruthless enforcer. The temperature in Billings, Montana, had plummeted to a historic 22 degrees below zero. The wind howled through the desolate snow-packed streets, carrying jagged shards of ice that felt like crushed glass against exposed skin. Garrett Miller kept his head down, pulling the thick faux fur collar of his heavy parka tighter around his neck. The coat was an absolute beast of a garment, a heavy-duty waterproof shell lined with dense sheepskin fleece. It was a prized possession, a hand-me-down from his late father, that had survived a decade of brutal, high plains winters. On a night like this, it was the only thing standing between Garrett and a trip to the morgue. Garrett, 29, was an honest, exhausted mechanic at Pioneer Garage. He worked grueling 60-hour weeks just to keep his head above water and pay off the mountain of medical debt his mother had left behind. His rusted truck had finally died that morning, forcing a miserable 2-mile trek from the shop to his cramped apartment. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting long, wavering shadows across the fresh snowdrifts. The entire city had practically shut down. Sensible people were locked indoors, huddled around radiators and roaring fireplaces. As Garrett cut through a dimly lit alley behind a derelict strip mall to shave a few minutes off his walk, he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was a faint, ragged gasping. He stopped his heavy boots, crunching in the snow, and peered into the darkness. Tucked beside an overflowing industrial dumpster, partially shielded from the biting wind, was a huddled figure. Garrett squinted through the swirling snow. It was a girl likely no older than 17. She was curled into a tight, trembling ball, wearing nothing but a thin, faded denim jacket, a tattered graphic t-shirt, and ripped jeans. She had no hat, no gloves, and her worn canvas sneakers were soaked through with freezing slush. "Hey!" Garrett called out, his breath pluming in the freezing air like thick white smoke. The girl flinched, pressing herself harder against the freezing brick wall. When she looked up, Garrett felt a sickening drop in his stomach. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and her skin was dangerously pale, bordering on translucent. Her teeth were chattering so violently that she couldn't even form words. She looked terrified, like a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Don't hurt me," she managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper over the howling wind. "I'm not going to hurt you," Garrett said softly, taking a slow, non-threatening step forward. "My name is Garrett. You can't be out here. It's 20 below zero. You're going to freeze to death." The girl just shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, only to freeze on her pale cheeks. "Can't go back? He'll find me. Please, just leave me alone." Garrett looked around the desolate alley. He knew he couldn't just walk away. The cold was already biting through his heavy denim jeans. This girl wouldn't last another hour in this weather. Hypothermia was already setting in. Her violently trembling body was her system's last-ditch effort to generate heat. "I'm not leaving you here to die," Garrett said firmly. He reached for his phone with numb fingers. "I'm calling an ambulance." "No." The girl practically shrieked, a sudden burst of panicked energy overcoming her lethargy. "No cops, no ambulances. Please, if they run my name, he'll know exactly where I am. I'm begging you, just let me be." Garrett hesitated. He didn't know what kind of trouble she was in. Maybe she was a runaway escaping an abusive home, or maybe she was running from someone far worse. But the immediate, undeniably fatal threat was the weather. Without a second thought, Garrett unzipped his father's heavy winter parka. The moment the frigid air hit his chest, clad only in a flannel shirt and a thermal undershirt, his lungs violently contracted. The cold was an agonizing physical punch to the torso. He stepped forward and draped the massive insulated coat over the girl's trembling shoulders. The sheer weight of the parka seemed to ground her. She looked up at him in utter shock, her blue lips parting in disbelief. "Put your arms through the sleeves," Garrett commanded, his teeth already beginning to chatter. "Zip it all the way up to your chin." "But you'll freeze," she whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the heavy brass zipper. "I live 10 blocks from here." "I can run," Garrett lied. He lived 20 blocks away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, his lunch money for the week. He shoved it into the parka's deep fleece pocket. "Listen to me. 3 blocks north down on Grand Avenue, there's a 24-hour diner called Hank's. Go there. Order hot soup and black coffee. Stay inside. They don't kick people out on nights like this." The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and lingering fear. "Why are you doing this?" "Because nobody deserves to freeze in an alley," Garrett said, his body already shuddering violently from the extreme exposure. "What's your name?" "Harper," she whispered. "Stay alive, Harper. Go to the diner." Garrett didn't wait for her to reply. He turned and started sprinting down the alleyway. The wind tore through his flannel shirt, instantly slicing into his skin like invisible razors. By the 5th block, he couldn't feel his hands or his face. By the 12th block, his legs felt like lead weights, and a strange, dangerous warmth began to spread through his chest, a classic, terrifying sign of advanced hypothermia. He burst through the door of his apartment building nearly 20 minutes later, collapsing onto the linoleum floor of the lobby. He dragged himself up the stairs, threw himself into his shower, and turned the hot water on, full blast, screaming in agony as the heat hit his frost-bitten skin. He spent the next 3 days fighting a violent, rattling cough and a fever, lying awake at night, wondering if the girl named Harper had made it to the diner, or if he had simply given away his father's coat to a ghost. 3 days later, the extreme cold wave finally broke, leaving the city buried under a thick blanket of gray, soot-stained snow. Garrett was back at Pioneer Garage. He looked like hell-dark circles hung heavy under his eyes, and a deep, chest-rattling cough escaped him every time he exerted himself. Still, bills needed to be paid, and engines needed to be rebuilt. It was a quiet Wednesday afternoon. Garrett was underneath a Chevy Silverado, struggling to loosen a rusted catalytic converter, when he felt it. Before he heard the noise, he felt the vibration in the concrete floor. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping that rattled the heavy wrenches in his toolbox. Then came the sound, a deafening, guttural, unified roar of heavy V-twin engines. It wasn't one motorcycle, it was a pack. Garrett rolled out from under the truck, wiping grease from his forehead with a rag. Through the large, frosted bay windows of the garage, he saw them pulling into the snow-cleared lot. 12 massive, custom Harley-Davidson choppers, moving with military precision. The riders killed their engines almost simultaneously. The sudden silence that followed was suffocating. They wore heavy leather jackets over thick hoodies, but the patches on their backs were unmistakably visible. The winged death head, the red and white lettering. The top rocker read Hell's Angels, and the bottom rocker proudly displayed Montana. Garrett's heart hammered against his ribs. The 81. You didn't see the Hell's Angels rolling deep into a random suburban mechanic's shop unless someone had made a very, very fatal mistake. Frank, the crusty 60-year-old owner of Pioneer Garage, stepped out of the office, his face draining of all color. "Garrett," Frank hissed. "Get in the back, now." But before Garrett could move, the heavy glass doors of the bay were pushed open. 5 men walked in. They were massive, hardened men, exuding an aura of pure, unadulterated violence. The leader stepped forward. He was a giant of a man, easily 6'4", with a thick, graying beard and a deep, jagged scar that ran from his left ear down to his collarbone. His eyes were dead and cold, taking in the garage with a predatory calculation. And in his massive leather-clad hand, he was holding Garrett's father's heavy winter parka. Garrett's blood ran cold. The cough died in his throat. "Harper." "Who runs this shop?" the leader demanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deep, threatening resonance that echoed off the cinder-block walls. "I do," Frank said, his voice trembling slightly. "Frank Miller. Can I help you, gentlemen?" The giant walked past Frank as if he didn't exist, his boots thudding heavily against the concrete. He stopped in the center of the garage and held up the heavy parka. "I'm looking for the man who gave this coat to a little girl 3 nights ago," the leader said. Silence hung heavy in the air. Garrett's mind raced. What had happened to her? Did she freeze to death? Was she hit by a car? Did they find her body wearing his coat and track it back to him? Or worse, was Harper mixed up with the club? And he had somehow interfered with their business. The Angels were famously ruthless. If they thought he had harmed one of their own or taken something from them, they wouldn't hesitate to burn the entire garage to the ground with him inside it, I said. The giant repeated his voice, dropping an octave. "Who owns this coat?" The other 4 bikers shifted their weight, crossing their arms. The implicit threat of violence was thick enough to choke on. Frank looked terrified, completely clueless. Garrett swallowed hard. He couldn't let Frank take the fall for this. He wiped his greasy hands on his coveralls, took a deep breath, and stepped out from the shadow of the Silverado. "It's mine," Garrett said. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his fear. The leader turned his cold, dead eyes onto Garrett. He moved with a terrifying, predatory grace, closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He stopped mere inches from Garrett's face. The smell of cold leather exhaust fumes and stale tobacco rolled off him in waves. "Your name," the giant growled. "Garrett. Garrett Miller." "My name is William Reynolds," the man said, "but my brothers call me Grip." Grip looked down at the coat in his hands, then back at Garrett. The tension was unbearable. Garrett braced himself fully, expecting the massive biker to pull a weapon or throw a punch that would shatter his jaw. Instead, Grip reached out with blinding speed and grabbed Garrett by the front of his heavy canvas coveralls. He practically lifted Garrett off his toes, pulling him so close their noses almost touched. "Where did you find her?" Grip demanded, his eyes suddenly burning with an intense, furious fire. In an alley." Garrett stammered, his heart threatening to burst from his chest. "Behind the old strip mall on 4th. 3 nights ago. It was freezing." "Did you touch her?" Grip snarled, his grip tightening the knuckles of his thick gloves, turning white. No, I swear to God," Garrett pleaded, raising his hands. "She was freezing to death. She was shaking so hard she couldn't speak." I took off my coat and gave it to her. I gave her $20 and told her to go to Hank's diner to warm up. That's it. That's all I did, I swear. Grip stared into Garrett's eyes, searching for any hint of a lie. The silence stretched out, agonizing and breathless. Garrett could hear his own heartbeat thrumming in his ears. Finally, Grip slowly lowered Garrett back to the ground, though he didn't release his hold on the coveralls. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "That girl," Grip said, his voice trembling with a barely suppressed emotion that sounded dangerously like grief, "is my daughter." Garrett's eyes widened in sheer shock. His daughter. The terrified, freezing runaway in the alley was the flesh and blood of a Hells Angels enforcer. She ran away from her mother's place in Seattle a week ago. Grip continued, his jaw clenching. Got mixed up with a bad crowd, a scumbag dealer who thought he could use her to clear a debt. She's been running ever since. We've been tearing this state apart, looking for her. Is she okay? Garrett managed to ask, genuinely terrified for the girl. Grip finally let go of Garrett's coveralls. He smoothed out the heavy parka in his hands. She passed out at Hank's diner. The waitresses called the paramedics. When the hospital ran her name, my contacts flagged it. We found her yesterday morning in the ICU. Severe hypothermia. Grip paused, his cold eyes locking onto Garrett's. The doctors said if she had been exposed for another 30 minutes, her organs would have completely shut down. The only reason she still has a pulse is because she was wearing this coat. Garrett exhaled a shaky breath, a wave of relief washing over him. Thank God. Grip turned to his men and gave a sharp, subtle nod. Two of the massive bikers stepped forward, flanking Garrett on either side. Get your tools, Grip ordered. Garrett blinked confusion, temporarily overriding his fear. What? You heard me. Grip said, his face hardening back into a mask of stone. Get your coat. You're coming with us. Frank rushed forward, finally finding his courage. Now hold on a minute. You can't just take him. Grip didn't even yell. He just shot Frank a look so lethally cold that the older man froze mid-step. Watch me. Grip turned back to Garrett. There's a black support van idling out back. Get in it. Don't make me ask twice. Garrett looked at the two enormous men flanking him, then back at Grip. There was no room for argument, no room for negotiation. He grabbed his father's coat from Grip's outstretched hand, the heavy fleece still smelling faintly of exhaust, and let himself be marched out the back door into the blinding winter glare. He had no idea where they were taking him. He only knew that when you owe the Hells Angels, or they owe you, your life is no longer your own. The back of the windowless support van smelled sharply of raw motor oil, stale tobacco and cold iron. Garrett sat rigidly on a hard metal bench, the heavy winter coat clutched desperately to his chest like a ballistic shield. Across from him in the suffocating gloom sat two behemoths, their massive frames swaying in unison with the aggressive turns of the vehicle. One biker had a neck as thick as a tree trunk, heavily tattooed with crawling black barbed wire that disappeared beneath the collar of his cut. The other possessed cold, unblinking eyes that stared right through Garrett, devoid of any recognizable human empathy. Neither man spoke a single syllable for the entire agonizing 45-minute drive, leaving Garrett alone with his racing, terrified thoughts. He mentally calculated the miles as the van hit the highway, the tires humming aggressively against the salted asphalt. They were leaving the city limits of Billings, heading deep into the desolate snow-covered foothills where law enforcement rarely patrolled and cell phone service vanished into thin air. His mind spiraled into dark, cinematic nightmares. Did they truly believe his story about the alley? What if Harper had slipped into a coma and Grip needed a scapegoat to unleash his violent grief upon the Hells Angels were notoriously insular? Their brand of frontier justice was legendary and absolute. Suddenly, the van tires crunched violently over a thick gravel road, slowing to a creeping halt. Heavy iron gates groaned open outside. When the back doors of the van were finally thrust open, the blinding winter sunlight felt like a physical assault. Out! The tattooed biker commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Garrett stumbled out into the freezing air, his boots finding purchase on the slick, hard-packed snow. He took a frantic look at his surroundings. They were parked inside a massive, heavily fortified compound, surrounded by 10-foot-high chain-link fencing, topped with wicked coils of razor wire. Security cameras were mounted at every conceivable vantage point, sweeping the perimeter with predatory mechanical precision. At the center of the gravel lot stood a sprawling warehouse-style structure, painted entirely in matte black. Above the reinforced steel entry doors, a massive, hand-painted Hell's Angel's death head stared down at him, its winged skull serving as a grim gargoyle for this modern-day fortress. The two bikers flanked him instantly, leaving no avenue for escape, and marched him toward the steel doors. They stepped inside, and the blinding snow glare was instantly replaced by the warm amber glow of dim overhead bulbs and neon beer signs. The clubhouse interior was massive, resembling an outlaw fortress built around a fully stocked industrial bar. Rows of pristine, customized Harley-Davidsons were parked meticulously against the far wall, like mechanical cavalry steeds waiting for war. The air was thick with the scent of leather brewing coffee and the undeniable tension of 50 hardened men moving with lethal purpose. At the center of the expansive room sat a colossal, scarred oak table. Grip was already there, leaning heavily against the wood. Beside him sat an older man with silver hair tied back in a tight ponytail, a neatly trimmed beard, and piercing, intelligent eyes. His leather cut bore the patch of the club president. "Bring him to the table," the president ordered. Garrett's legs felt like lead as he was ushered forward. He stopped at the edge of the oak wood, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his rib cage. "Garrett Miller." The president said, his tone conversational, but laced with absolute authority. "My name is Sullivan Hayes. I run this charter. Sit down." Garrett collapsed into a heavy wooden chair, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. Sullivan leaned forward, steepling his fingers together. "We are a brotherhood that operates on a very simple, very strict currency." Sullivan began, his intelligent eyes locking onto Garrett's. "Respect and debt. When someone disrespects this patch, we collect the toll. When someone does right by this patch, we balance the scales. 3 nights ago, you found Grip's daughter freezing to death. You didn't know who she was. You didn't ask for a reward. You took the coat off your own back, risked your own life to hypothermia, and gave her a fighting chance. Grip owes you his blood, which means this entire charter owes you. I don't want any trouble." Garrett managed to stammer, his voice painfully dry. "I just did what anyone else would have done." Grip let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the high warehouse ceilings. "Anyone else would have kept walking, kid. The world is full of cowards who look the other way." "You didn't." Sullivan raised a hand, silencing the room. "We did some digging on you, Garrett. When this club incurs a debt, we don't just hand over a wad of cash. We find out exactly what a man needs. We know about your mother, Margaret. We know she passed away from aggressive pancreatic cancer last year." Garrett flinched, the sudden mention of his mother sending a sharp, unexpected pang of grief through his chest. "How do you know that?" "We know everything," Sullivan said softly, his gaze entirely unreadable. "We also know that her insurance company abandoned her, and you took out a massive, crippling private loan to keep her in hospice care, so she wouldn't die in a county ward. A loan for $140,000. Garrett felt the blood drain from his face. It was his deepest, darkest secret. He was drowning in debt to a shadow company, barely making the extortionate monthly interest payments. "You borrowed that money from a man named Harrison Burke," Sullivan continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "What you probably didn't know is that Burke's loan agency is a money laundering front for the same underground cartel syndicate that was trying to use Harper to settle their own scores, the same scumbags who chased a 17-year-old girl into a blizzard." The room went dead silent. The twist hit Garrett like a physical blow to the stomach. The men who held his financial life in a death grip were connected to the very monsters who had nearly killed Harper. "Last night," Grip said, stepping forward, a dark, terrifying satisfaction dancing in his eyes. "My brothers and I paid Harrison Burke a little visit at his primary office. We had a very long, very educational conversation about predatory lending cartel connections and the severe consequences of operating in our territory without permission." Sullivan reached into his cut and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He tossed it casually across the scarred oak table. It slid to a halt right in front of Garrett. "Open it," Sullivan commanded. Garrett's hands shook violently as he reached for the envelope. He fumbled with the metal clasp, pulling out a thick stack of official documents. He recognized them instantly. They were the original promissory notes and binding financial contracts he had signed with Burke's agency, tying his wages, his future, and his life to the debt. Across every single page, stamped in bold, heavy red ink, was the word nullified. Attached to the front was a legally binding release of lien notarized and signed with a frantic, shaky signature that Garrett recognized as Harrison Burke's. "Your debt is gone," Sullivan stated, leaning back in his chair. Burke suddenly felt a profound surge of extreme charity. He wiped the slate clean. "You don't owe him a single dime, and he has permanently relocated to another state. If he ever shows his face in Montana again, we will bury him under the interstate." Garrett stared at the papers, utterly paralyzed. $140,000. Years of agonizing, suffocating panic, working 60 hours a week, just to survive completely erased in a single night of outlaw diplomacy. He couldn't breathe. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, an overwhelming tidal wave of relief crashing over him. I don't know what to say," Garrett choked out, looking up at the hardened men surrounding him. "You don't say anything," Grip replied, his voice gruff but lacking its previous lethal edge. "Because we aren't quite finished." Garrett wiped his eyes, thoroughly bewildered. The monumental weight of the erased debt was already causing the room to spin, but the absolute seriousness radiating from Grip's heavily scarred face indicated the transaction was far from over. Grip reached into his denim pocket and pulled out a keyring holding 3 brass keys, tossing them onto the oak table with a loud clatter. Garrett recognized the yellow rubber keychain instantly. It belonged to the Pioneer Garage front doors. "Frank is 65, his knees are shot, and he's wanted to move to Arizona for years," Grip said, crossing his arms. "We had our accountant approach him this morning with a highly lucrative cash offer for the shop, the land, and every piece of equipment inside. He signed the deed over an hour ago. He's packing his bags as we speak." Garrett stared from the gleaming keys to Grip, his mind completely short-circuiting in absolute disbelief. "You actually bought out Frank's garage. Why would you do that for me?" "We didn't buy it for ourselves," Sullivan interjected smoothly, casually, turning a heavy silver Zippo lighter in his weathered hands. "We bought it entirely for you. The legal deed is already in your name, Garrett. You own Pioneer Garage, free and clear." "No," Garrett said, pushing the keys back. "I can't accept an entire business." Grip slammed his fist down, making Garrett jump. "You don't disrespect the club by refusing a gift," Grip snarled. "You saved my little girl. You gave her your coat when you were freezing, and your last $20. Do you know what that means to a man like me? I deal in violence and blood. Then a broke mechanic shows my daughter pure mercy. Pioneer Garage is yours. Run it, but understand exactly what this means." Sullivan leaned forward, fixing Garrett with a grave stare. "Pioneer Garage is now under permanent protection of the Hells Angels. No gang will ever dare break a window. You are under our wing. But protection is a two-way street. If a brother breaks down at 3 a.m, you fetch him. If we need a quiet place to store bikes, no questions asked, you clear out a bay. From this day forward, You are a friend of the club. Do you understand the weight of that crown? Garrett looked down at the keys. He was being offered financial freedom, but he was also tying his fate to an outlaw motorcycle club. Before he could respond, the heavy wooden door clicked open. Standing there was Harper. She looked vastly different from the shivering ghost in the alley. She was pale, leaning on a wooden cane due to severe frostbite nerve damage, but she was clean, warm, and alive. Wearing an oversized hoodie, her blue eyes were bright. The hardened bikers immediately parted ways for her, their eyes softening with fierce protectiveness. Harper stopped in front of Garrett. She dropped her cane and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck. Garrett hesitated, before gently returning the hug. "Thank you so much," Harper whispered, fiercely, her voice trembling. "You saved my life that night. I would have closed my eyes forever, behind that freezing dumpster, and never opened them again." "I'm just incredibly glad you safely made it to the diner," Garrett replied, softly smiling. Harper pulled back, picking up the brass keys and pressing them into Garrett's hand. "Take the shop, Garrett," she said. "My dad doesn't know how to say thank you with words. He only knows actions. Let him do this." Garrett slowly slipped the keys into his pocket and looked directly at Sullivan, nodding his head once. "I understand the terms, Sullivan. The garage doors are always open for the club. You have my word." Grip stepped forward, pulling Garrett into a fierce half-embrace. "Welcome to the family, kid," he rumbled. Garrett walked out of the compound 20 minutes later, the nullified contract secured in his pocket and the keys to his future jingling. He had walked into the alley drowning in debt and walked out under the wing of the Hells Angels. As he tightly zipped up his father's heavy winter coat, he knew with absolute certainty that he would never be cold again. Did this incredible story of fate, survival, and unexpected brotherhood keep you on the edge of your seat? Sometimes the greatest angels wear leather instead of wings. If you loved this real-life biker drama, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable true stories. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would do today. Stay safe out there.